Black Plague, also known as the Black Death, is a bacterial infection found mainly in rodents and their fleas. But because of the fleas, it can sometimes leap onto humans. However, this epidemic started with a rodent bite in Europe in the early 14th century. Even though the Black Plague was a tragedy for all of Europe, there was also a great triumph for those who survived. The Black Plague killed 30 to 50% of Europe in just 3 years in the late 14th century. The plague epidemic in Europe gave us the medically based hospitals we have today. This medieval pandemic that swept through Europe killed an estimated 25 million people. Since the outbreak in the 14th century, there have been few cases. However, the plague still exists everywhere with no vaccines. There are 3 types of this plague: the bubonic plague, the septicemic plague, and the pneumonic plague. The bubonic plague is the plague that affected Europe, and it's the disease's most common form. It causes painfully swollen lymph nodes that appear around the armpits, neck, and other covered areas. It spreads into the bloodstream, comes either from the fleas or from plague-infected body, somebody else touching you that already has the plague. The plague first came to Europe through the loading docks in Dorset in 1346. The plague then spread in exponential growth, reaching nearly all of Europe by 1353. Within 10 days of contracting the plague, people usually develop flu-like symptoms including fever, chills, headaches, body aches, weakness, vomiting, and nausea. The expression Black Death comes from a later symptom of the disease. Skin and flesh die and they turn black. The pneumonic plague is the least common, but is also the most deadly form of the disease. It is also the only type that is airborne. There are 4 main phases of the bubonic plague, the first of which is the incubation period, in which you may not notice any symptoms. However, it lasts from 2 to 6 days after you got infected. The next phase would be violent flu symptoms. This includes vomiting, and it's also accompanied by blisters around the groin, armpits, and the neck. The next phase is a phase in which your skin starts to die off, turning your extremities, your fingers and your toes, black. The patient may also start vomiting blood. The effects of the plague did not only just include the deaths, it also includes the surprising cost. Just 54 deaths of the plague caused $600 million in lost tourist and trade revenue. However, most of this was made up for the fact that there were less people to be paid. The triumph that came along with this pandemic was that most hospitals we know today that are medically based came from this pandemic. Most hospitals before the bubonic plague hit Europe were based on religion and prayers that the sick would get better. This is very different from the hospitals we know today that prescribe medications and such to help the wounded get better. During the outbreak of the bubonic plague, people mostly realized that prayers were not going to help people, and that they actually needed to physically help stop whatever was happening to all of their people.